professor at the University of Puerto Rico. And this is a panel that we have organized, the Political Science Department of the University of Puerto Rico, as part of an effort to discuss questions related to the citizenship in Puerto Rico. We are at the present time working in a publication with the University of Puerto Rico Law Journal that is going to be coming out next year, 2022, when we are going to be making a critical assessment of one of the most important insular cases in the history of the United States Supreme Court, which is Balzac versus Puerto Rico, that will be 100 years old next year, and we are planning to be able to do a critical assessment of that case in particular and of the insular cases in general. And one of the professors that is going to be participating in that effort is Sparrow, which is one of the panelists that is going to be presenting tonight. So it's a great pleasure to have you all here in this panel, which is entitled Vaello-Madero, What to Expect Now. This panel is the product of an effort of many people. I would like to give my gratitude to Hector Martinez, which is the chair of the Political Science Department, that helped us a lot to coordinate this activity, and to Natasha Ramos, which is a student assistant that has been working in this project about citizenship that we are being able to accomplish with the support of the University of Puerto Rico. Vaello-Madero is the last name of a person that has become very famous in recent times in Puerto Rico. The very basic situation that gave way to this case was the fact that it was receiving funding of a particular program that we're going to be explaining, which is SSI, Social Security Supplemental Income. And he moved back to Loíza, to his family, and he lost the benefits that he had acquired while living in New York, and that gave basis to an action from the U.S. government to have him reimburse $28,000 that he had received while residing in Puerto Rico. That's the basis of the case that we're going to be explaining tonight with an excellent panel. I'm going to introduce the panelists now. First panelist is Professor Willmai Rivera Perez. She's an associate professor of law at the Southern University Law Center in Louisiana. She clerked for Associate Justice Antonio S. Negron Garcia at the Puerto Rico Supreme Court, a very respected judge at the Supreme Court of Puerto Rico. Her areas of research interests include comparative law, constitutional law, Latino critical theory, transitional justice, international law, human rights law, sociology of law, and mixed legal jurisdictions. Professor Rivera Perez earned her BA in Political Science and Juris Doctor from the University of Puerto Rico in Río Piedras. She was my student. I'm very, very proud of it. In 2006, she earned her LLM degree from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. She's a Doctor of Juridical Science degree awarded by the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. Her doctoral dissertation explores the role that the international human rights discourse has had in the adoption and development of the direct application of constitutional norms to relations arising from disputes between private parties in Latin America. Professor Sparrow studies American political development and in particular the conjunction between the American state and the international system. He teaches courses on American territorial expansion, American political institutions and processes, American politics and government, political communication, and the politica of food in America. He has received fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, John Sorenstein Center for the Press, Politics and Public Policy at Harvard University, and Harry S. Truman Library Institute. Sparrow is the author of The Insular Cases and the Emergence of American Empire. The last panelist is Sergio M. Marxuach. He is the Policy Director and General Counsel at the Center of the New Economy, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. Prior to joining the center, Mr. Marxuach served as Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Economic Development for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and as a Special Assistant to the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Office of Management and Budget. Before joining the Commonwealth government, he was an associate for 5 years in the New York City law firm of Curtis, Mallet, Prevost, called Mosley, where he worked mostly in Latin American transactions and international corporate matters. Mr. Marxuach has a BA in Economics and Political Science from Vaello University, where he was awarded the Henry Awards Ellsworth Prize for his senior essay. He also obtained a Juris Doctor degree from the Georgetown University Law Center and a Master's of Science in Foreign Service from the Graduate School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. So as you can tell, we have an extremely professional and an expert panel here with us. We're very happy to be able to have them with us tonight. And to begin the presentation and what is that got us here, I would let Sergio Marxuach to start the panel tonight.
Thank you, Javier, and for the opportunity to participate tonight. Good night to everybody. I hope everybody's doing well, and thank you for connecting to our panel. I'm going to briefly explain what SSI is, and then I'm going to spend a little more time on the factual background of this case and the procedural background. I think it's very interesting how there are certain things here that are not usual, let's put it that way. And I think they're worth taking a look. And then I will conclude with a summary of what the arguments that were made in the Supreme Court, a very brief summary that were recently made in the Supreme Court by both parties. To begin, the Supplemental Security Income Program was created by Congress in 1972 to replace the Aid to the Age-Blind or Disabled AABD program. Individuals are eligible for SSI if, after applying for any other benefits for which they may qualify, their personal and household incomes are below certain thresholds and they are aged, usually above 65, blind or disabled, as such terms are defined in the federal regulations. However, individuals who reside outside the United States for 30 days or more are not eligible for benefits. For purposes of SSI, Congress defined the term United States to include only the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Congress also determined at that time that the old AABD program will continue to operate in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands instead of SSI. SSI, however, provides substantially higher benefits to a substantially greater number of people than AABD. For example, under AABD, some 34,000 Puerto Rico residents currently receive an average monthly payment of $58. If SSI applied to Puerto Rico, the Center for the New Economy where I work, we estimate that approximately 400,000 Puerto Rico residents would qualify and receive an average monthly payment of $493. Mr. Jose Luis Vaello-Madero lived in New York City between 1985 and 2013. There he applied, qualified for, and received SSI disability benefits, which were deposited directly into his New York bank account. In July 2013, he moved to Puerto Rico and continued receiving SSI disability payments through his New York bank account until August 2016. Throughout this time, he was unaware that his relocation would affect his ability to receive SSI disability benefits. In June 2016, the Social Security Administration sent him 2 notices, retroactively lowering his SSI benefits to 0, effective August 13, solely because, by virtue of establishing residency in Puerto Rico, he was deemed to be outside the United States. The SSA, however, never sent him a notice of overpayment, which would have allowed Mr. Vaello-Madero to dispute the liability through administrative channels. This would actually turn out to be important, as Justice Kavanaugh and I think one other raised this avenue to dispose of the case, whether or not there were ways to deal with this administratively. Instead, a year later, the U.S. government brought suit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Puerto Rico to recover $28,000 in SSI payments that he had allegedly misappropriated. Under the threat of criminal prosecution and only days after Hurricane Irma had caused extensive damage to Loíza, where he had relocated, an SSA investigator approached Mr. Vaello-Madero without the presence of counsel of any attorneys and asked him to sign a stipulation for consent judgment, which he signed. Nonetheless, the court appointed pro bono counsel for Mr. Vaello-Madero, and Mr. Vaello-Madero then successfully moved to withdraw the stipulation for consent judgment. Mr. Vaello-Madero then filed an answer challenging the use of a criminal statute as a predicate for the civil action and attacking the constitutionality of denying SSI benefits to residents of Puerto Rico on equal protection grounds. In response, the United States moved for the voluntary dismissal of its own cause of action, acknowledging its lack of jurisdiction under the law and alleging that the SSA, the Social Security Act's administrative requirements have not been met. In May 2018, however, then District Court Judge Gustavo Helpi denied the United States motion for dismissal, holding that the court, quote, agrees with Vaello-Madero that the United States voluntary dismissal raises the prospect that the United States may be trying to abandon its chosen forum in response to what it might perceive as a serious setback. The court will not allow the United States to avoid judicial review of an unsympathetic topic using jurisdictional pretexts. Both parties then proceeded to file motions for summary judgment. Mr. Vaello-Madero argued that he was not required to return the payments he received in SSI disability benefits upon changing his domicile to Puerto Rico, since excluding him solely on the basis of residence in territory was a violation of the equal protection guarantees of the Due Process Clause. The United States argued in turn that Congress's determinations as to eligibility requirements for government benefits hold a strong presumption of constitutionality. Furthermore, the United States claimed that Congress's authority under the Territorial Clause enables it to enact economic and social welfare legislation that treats differently the residents of the territory where there is a rational basis for such actions. In February 2019, the district court denied the government's motion and granted Vaello-Madero's motion for summary judgment. In denying the government's motion, the courts dismissed its reliance on 2 per curiam opinions of the late 1970s and 1980s, Califano versus Torres in 1978 and Harris versus Rosario in 1980, arguing that such reliance ignored subsequent developments in the constitutional landscape. Perhaps more important, the district court determined that even if Califano and Harris applied, the government's arguments that 1, the cost of including Puerto Rico in the SSI program would be too high, and 2, that Puerto Rico does not pay federal income tax, which funds the SSI program, failed to justify the categorical exclusion of the residents of Puerto Rico from the SSI program, even under the most lenient equal protection analysis, the so-called rational basis test, which requires that a law be rationally related to a legitimate government interest to be upheld. Professor Rivera will analyze this part of the decision in depth later, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. Moving on then to the appeal to the First Circuit, the United States appealed, and a panel composed by Judges Howard, Torreya, and Thompson heard the arguments. In its appeal, the US government expanded its argument based on Califano and Harris. In those cases, the Supreme Court of the United States found 3 valid rationales for denying SSI benefits in Califano and AFDC benefits in Harris to residents of Puerto Rico, based solely on the fact of their residence in Puerto Rico. Namely, 1, residents of Puerto Rico are generally exempt from paying the personal federal income tax. 2, the cost of extending these programs to Puerto Rico would be very high. And 3, fully granting these benefits in Puerto Rico might disrupt the island's economy. In Vaello-Madero, the Court of Appeals disentangled itself from the holdings in Califano and Harris by differentiating the legal theory of those cases from the legal theory presented by the plaintiff. With respect to Califano, it found that while it indeed upheld the categorical exclusion of Puerto Rico residents from the SSI program, it was decided as a right to travel case, not on equal protection grounds. With respect to Harris, it found that while it was indeed an equal protection case, that case did not concern SSI, but rather AFDC, which was a federal block grant under the under federal jurisdiction. That program has been eliminated since then. A distinction, specifically being a block grant, a distinction that the court found significant in Vaello-Madero. The court then concluded that the Supreme Court has never ruled on the validity of the alleged discriminatory treatment of Puerto Rico residents as required by the SSI program under the prism of equal protection. Notice that the First Circuit did not overturn or invalidate the holdings in Califano and Harris. In fact, those cases are still, quote, the law of the land. Rather, it differentiated those cases from Vaello-Madero. Having found that neither Califano nor Harris were controlling precedents in the case of Vaello, the First Circuit went on to conclude that none of the government arguments in those cases, which were raised by the United States again in Vaello-Madero, provided a rational basis for upholding the exclusion of the residents of Puerto Rico from participating in the SSI program. The court found that the income tax rationale is inadequate because the beneficiaries of these programs are by definition low-income individuals who generally do not pay income tax no matter where they live. Number 2, the high cost of providing these benefits to the residents of Puerto Rico also failed the rational basis test because facing budgetary constraints, Congress could have spread out benefit reductions equally, or it could have excluded any slice of the population. So why pick residents of Puerto Rico? In essence, wanting to cut costs cannot explain who gets cut. Finally, the Vaello-Madero court analyzed the economic disruption argument, even though the government had not raised it at the district court level. In essence, the government's argument in Califano and Harris was that extending these benefit programs may have an especially adverse impact on labor incentives on the island. However, the First Circuit found that the economic disruption theory cannot rationally explain the categorical exclusion of residents of Puerto Rico from these particular programs. That is so in part because these programs all provide uniform benefits nationwide, no matter the local poverty rate or other economic variations. Thus, the court concluded on April 10, 2020, that the categorical exclusion of otherwise eligible Puerto Rico residents from SSI was not rationally related to a legitimate government interest, and such exclusion of residents of Puerto Rico was declared invalid. On September 4, 2020, the U.S. filed a petition for a writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court of the United States. The petition was granted on March 1st, 2021, and oral arguments were held on November 9, 2021. In its brief before the Supreme Court, the United States government made 3 arguments. 1, the Court of Appeals erred in holding that Congress's decision not to extend the SSI program to Puerto Rico lacks a rational basis because a court owes Congress substantial deference when it assesses a law under the rational basis test. Puerto Rico's unique tax status and resulting fiscal autonomy provide a rational basis for the decision not to extend the SSI program to its residents. The interest in advancing self-government and long-standing practice reinforce the rationality of Congress's decision not to extend the SSI program to Puerto Rico, and Congress also had a rational ground to treat Puerto Rico differently than the residents of the Northern Mariana Islands. Number two, Vaello-Madero erred in arguing that the differential treatment of the territories warrants heightened scrutiny because the constitutional text establishes that Congress may treat a territory differently than the states if it has a rational basis to do so. That's kind of a circular argument, but that's what they argue. Congress's power to treat territories differently than the states draws additional support from its broader authority to draw rational geographic distinctions, and equal protection doctrine confirms that Congress may treat a territory differently than the states if it has a rational basis to do so. Finally, the doctrine of stare decisis supports retaining Torres and Rosario, which is how they refer to Harris and Califano and Harris. In its brief before the Supreme Court, counsel for Mr. Vaello-Madero also made three arguments. Strict scrutiny should apply to the exclusion of Puerto Rico residents from SSI because Puerto Rico residents are politically powerless and had suffered a history of discrimination based on race and ancestry. And Puerto Rico's unique, between quotes, status does not preclude, but rather compels strict scrutiny. Number two, under any standard review, according to counsel for Mr. Vaello, the exclusion fails. And number three, Califano and Harris should be overruled. To say the least, this case raises some interesting questions, both of policy and politics of U.S.-Puerto Rico relations, which I hope we can explore in the question and answer session. And now I pass it along to Professor Rivera.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's really an honor to be back, although virtually, to where all began at the Department of Social Sciences of the University of Puerto Rico, Recinto de Río Piedras. I'm really, really happy, and hopefully we have a very nice and good discussion about this interesting topic. So I'll explain by Sergio, the issue in this case is whether or not a categorical exclusion of residents of Puerto Rico from the SSI program is constitutional under the Equal Protection Clause through the due process clause of the Fifth. And of course, that doesn't say a lot. So what I was asked to go over is how is it that the courts determine which type of test to use? The United States, as many of you know, courts have the power to declare the constitutionality of the actions of the two branches, the executive and the legislative. And this is known, of course, as judicial review. The court uses tests to make the determination of the validity of the law. And ordinarily, we know about three types of tests. So we have rational tests, intermediate tests, and strict scrutiny tests. All of these tests are or work in the same manner because they work as a means to goal analysis. We're going to look at the purpose and what are the means that the legislative has chosen to achieve that purpose. In the case, and for now, the only thing that we should know is that the test used will be different depending on the type of claim that the plaintiff is arguing, okay? So let's talk about the rational basis test. This was the test that was used by the circuit court decision, and it held that even using this very, very lax test, the government did not meet the challenge. Laws that are reviewed under the rational basis test, first of all, are presumed to be constitutional. It's for the plaintiff to make and show that their laws are not rationally related to a legitimate state interest. But what does that mean in reality? It means that the challenger has to prove that the purpose of the law is not to advance a legitimate purpose or that there is no legitimate purpose in the law, and that the means achieved are not reasonable. And when we talk about reasonable, it doesn't mean that it has to be the best way to achieve that goal or the most expedient way to achieve that goal. As a matter of fact, any type of presumed way of achieving that goal is okay. The court admits reasons that are thought after litigation. You don't have to have an actual purpose. The thing that Congress actually used to think about the law and the means. And this is why a challenger using the rational basis test has to negate every possible conceivable basis for this type of law. So you are basically chasing a unicorn, trying to say there is no way this law can be rational. The means have to be reasonable. And again, this does not require that it has to be the best way to achieve. As long as the means chosen are not irrational or arbitrary, the law will be held constitutional. So as you see, it is very hard to have a law declared unconstitutional if the review that the court will use is based on the rational test. Opposite to the rational test, we have the strict scrutiny. Here is for the government to prove that the means chosen are necessary and that the purpose of the law is not only important, but is vital. Here, the burden of proof changes. Is for the government to prove that the legislation is, or the action in the case of the executive, is constitutional and compliant. So when we're talking about comparing rational with strict scrutiny, if you are the one claiming the unconstitutionality of the law, you want the strict scrutiny on your side. Because as been said by Gerald Gunter, this test is strict in scrutiny or in theory, but is fatal in fact. And laws that are reviewed under a strict scrutiny, 99.9% of the time will be held to be unconstitutional. And that is, the Constitutional Law 101. But why is this different? Why is it that we have different tests? There has to be a reason. Why is it that the court sometimes assumes the constitutionality of the law when other times it says, no, you have to prove that is a good law, that you have to prove that this law actually meets the burden? And for that, we have to go to a period known as the Lochner era, and to a footnote 4 of Caroline Provitt. During the Lochner era, the Supreme Court used the due process clause in economic substantive due process law to held unconstitutional several economic and social policies. The idea was that you have a right, Congress cannot take it away, and it has to prove the reasons, the vital reasons as to why it will take your right away. Of course, time passed. This was early 20th century. And by 1936, things changed. We had the Great Depression, we have the re-election of President Roosevelt, and we have the court packing plan. And all that put together changed the way the court viewed its own role within the judicial structure and the governmental structure of the United States. So the court changed its view, and it's decided that it's not for the courts, but for the political branches that are accountable to the people to decide upon policies that do not affect fundamental rights or that do not use classifications that are deemed to be suspect, like race, like alienage, like ethnicity. The court in that famous footnote said the following: the court from now on will not went over and second guess the reasons given by the legislative if and unless we are dealing with one, fundamental rights as enriched in the Constitution First 10 Amendments. Two, if the law restricts the ability to have access to the political process. And number three, if the law discriminates in the ability to have access to the political process, or when the law discriminates against people that don't have the power to amass political enough people to push for legislation. So what the court in this footnote is doing is making a divide upon when is it that we are going to intervene and require more from the government. We will require more when there are fundamental rights involved, or when the rights of those that have been limited are persons or individuals that, as the court said, are part of an insular minority. And this is very important for this case, I think, because if we go to the major argument that has been brought by Vaello in his petition to the Supreme Court, he's asking the court to use a strict scrutiny to evaluate the categorical exception of residents of Puerto Rico to the SSI program. What Vaello is claiming, it's saying, hey, I know that under equal protection, location is not a suspect category. And because of that, you should or you would use rational basis tests. But we should move from that and use a strict scrutiny, because what we're excluding are individuals that do not have political power because they reside in the island of Puerto Rico. Vaello expressly said in his brief that Puerto Rico residents are the quintessential example of political powerless, discrete and insular minorities. The impossibility of those who reside in Puerto Rico to participate in the US political process closes the only route available to have any influence or say in the policies that affect them. Ergo, Vaello says, it should follow that it's for the court using strict scrutiny to protect those interests. As Sergio mentioned, the US government, on the other hand, is asking the court just to revoke the First Circuit decision that concluded that even using the rational basis test, the arguments presented by the US government are not persuasive and do not meet the very lax standard of the rational test. The US government is claiming that the law should be reviewed under the rational test, one, because the legislation is about a social welfare program. Thus, it doesn't involve any fundamental right. But more importantly, in his written brief, it also says that this law concerns a territory. So, although interestingly, in the oral arguments, the lawyer for the US government tried to back down on that tenet for his argument, when he was pressed by the justices, he had to come back and say, of course, the territorial clause matters. The government is also relying in the text of Harris v. Rosario and Califano Torres, particularly the segment of Harris, which is a summary reversal, take notice of that, summary reversal, that consists just of 2 paragraphs, in which in the second paragraph, the Supreme Court says that Congress may treat Puerto Rico differently from the state so long as there is a rational basis for its action. So, do the territories clause matters? Of course it matters. Of course it matters because it is because of the territories clause that Congress has been allowed to regulate the unincorporated territory and its residents without any type of political accountability. And if the opportunity of political accountability is what stops the judiciary from intervening with electoral branches, then that route has been closed since the inception for those who reside in the island. In this time of era, to still defend a blatant colonial system that grew out of discriminatory premises, as Igartua said, downgrading the rights of discrete minorities within the political hegemony of the United States is just indefensible. The last 7 years, we have seen cases brought basically saying the same thing. Congress could not still use, although in the Constitution, its powers to regulate the territories in a way that discriminates against residents of a location that do not have any political say when those determinations are made. We know about Promesa, we know what that did to Puerto Rico, and whether or not this case will get a different answer for the question posed to the Supreme Court, that is up for grabs. But I think that the argument that is being brought by Vaello is basically putting head over heels how we think about rational basis tests and the functions of those tests. If in reality the rational basis test needs or asks for deference from the courts because there are political avenues to change policies, then the rational basis test is not useful at all to determine the constitutionality of this categorical exclusion of Puerto Rico residents from the SSI program. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now gonna have the participation of Sparrow from Texas, which we have declared is the optimist in the group.
Good evening. Thank you, Javier, and my fellow panelists, Natasha and the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, and the others who made this possible, and to you in the audience. It is said that the Supreme Court doesn't get the easy cases, and so it is here. What we have are two competing constitutional doctrines that have been laid out already for us. The first, deriving from the Territory Clause, is that Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, meaning that Congress can differentiate between the territories and the states, and this is constitutional doctrine for the court. Per the insular cases, if Congress wishes to keep the U.S. territories as territories and not necessarily destine them for statehood, then that is its prerogative. To support the U.S. government against Vaello-Madero then would uphold the incorporation doctrine, distinguishing the United States unincorporated territories from the states proper and from the previous states or territories destined for statehood. The other principle in play here is of the equal protection guarantee of the Fifth Amendment. Because the geographical entity of Puerto Rico is indistinguishable from its unique ethnicity and culture, and because Puerto Ricans have been historically discriminated against to deny supplemental security income to Vaello-Madero and other worthy recipients merits heightened scrutiny under the law. To rule for the respondents would, as the government asserts, overturn Harris and Califano, and as the Solicitor General further claims, open the door to the equal treatment of other federal benefits under U.S. law, such as Medicare and the temporary assistance for needy families, and come at some cost to the federal government. Yet, the decisions of the court often depart from the sense of the oral argument, from the arguments in the amicus briefs filed on behalf of the plaintiffs and respondents, and from the litigants' briefs themselves, and of course from lower court decisions. So let me suggest three reasons why there may be good chance that the court does not uphold the federal government, specifically the Social Security Administration, contrary to its decisions in the last three cases involving Puerto Rico that arrived to the Supreme Court: Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valley, Puerto Rico versus Franklin, California Tax-Free Trust, and Aurelius. So the first reason, there is deep resistance to the insular cases and on at least two fronts. One is criticism. As Deputy Solicitor General Gannon acknowledged in oral argument, and as the Chief Justice and Justice Sotomayor and Gorsuch inferred in their questioning, the insular cases were wrongly decided. They have been vilified by legal scholars and other jurists in law journal articles, amicus briefs, and books. And as the Deputy Solicitor General further noted, some of the reasoning and rhetoric in the insular cases were obviously anathema. Justice Breyer referred to the much criticized insular cases and their progeny in his decision for the court in Aurelius, and the late Judge Juan Torella, also on the First District Court decision in Vaello, spoke and wrote of the political apartheid legitimated by the insular cases and perpetuated by the incorporation doctrine arising out of the insular cases. The other form of resistance is more radical. There's a refusal to litigate and even discuss the insular cases more than very briefly, if at all. We see this in Gannon's comment that however anathema the insular cases may be, they weren't relevant to the case at hand. We also see this reluctance in Justice Breyer's opinion for the court in Aurelius, in which he refuses to address the insular cases, and is evident in the absence of any mention of the insular cases, Downs v. Bidwell or Balzac versus Puerto Rico in Sanchez Valley. Alternatively, the court has simply denied certiorari per toi, the Samoan case. In the words of two prominent legal scholars, the court has deliberately sought to distance American constitutional law from the insular cases. Now, the irony is, as has already been pointed out, is that the insular cases remain profoundly relevant, consistent with Justice White's concurring opinion in Downs. They established that Congress did not have to uniformly apply the Constitution to its new, now renamed, unincorporated territories, and this doctrine had not been formally coined or applied to the Mexican Cession, to Deseret and the Utah Territory, to Alaska upon its purchase in 1867, or to Washington City, the federal district, when it was a territory between 1871 and 1874, or to other U.S. territories. So my conclusion for this first reason or first cause of optimism is that denial of equal protection of social SSI benefits to Puerto Ricans is not a rational basis for such geographical discrimination obtaining under a federal law passed in 1938. This is also the argument of the Guam District Court's opinion in Schaller versus U.S. Social Security Administration, also issued in 2020. Indeed, the Rehnquist Court referred to the insular cases, specifically Downs and Balzac, in support of Juan Torella's term of political apartheid in its per curiam decision in Harris. This is very different, I would argue, from upholding the protection against double jeopardy in Sanchez Valley, however wrongly decided that case might have been, in my view. So distinguishing this case about unequal treatment of Puerto Ricans versus the double jeopardy in Sanchez Valley. Secondly, and very briefly, the court has displayed organizational learning. When I compared oral argument in Sanchez Valley to Aurelius and then to Vaello-Madero, it was clear that in the 13 years since the 2007 decisions in Boumediene, that the Roberts Court shows much greater knowledge and sophistication of Puerto Rico and the U.S. territories, notwithstanding the recent additions of Justices Barrett and Kavanaugh. There's movement on this front, and there's little reason to think that the court will issue other than a narrow decision. Indeed, indicatively, the first question by Justice Thomas to Gannon in the oral argument was asking about the application of the territory clause to Vaello-Madero. 3, Justice Thomas's question in oral arguments bears heeding. He did not like the distinction between Puerto Rico and Vermont, just as he didn't between the rights of Indian nations and those of the states and the territories in his oral argument in Sanchez Valley. Justice Ginsburg's concurrence in Sanchez Valley is also worth flagging. She pointed out in this case of double jeopardy applied to Puerto Rico that states and the nation are kindred systems, citing Federalist 82, yet parts of one whole. Within that whole is not an affront to human dignity, per Justice Black in a 1959 dissenting opinion, is an inconsistent with the spirit of our Bill of Rights to try and just punish a person twice for the same offense. Justice Ginsburg is, of course, past, but the questions of Justice Thomas, Justice Kagan, and certainly Justice Sotomayor and Breyer suggest that there may be a change in the lay of the political climate. This new political climate is further evidence in the amici briefs. The Puerto Rican Bar Association argued that excluding Puerto Rico from SSI program is contrary to the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment and therefore unconstitutional. So too did the Virgin Islands Bar Association. Now, this, of course, is what we might expect as other territorial organizations. But it was also the recommendation of the amici briefs of Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Virginia, as well, more expectedly, the District of Columbia, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands, which already is protected to receive SSI benefits. Less expectedly, though, it was also the view of the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, from which I now receive solicitations, and it was also, which strongly noted the strict and complex medical criteria to qualify for SSI disability benefits, the fact that over the 40% of Puerto Ricans' elderly population live in poverty, and that Puerto Rico's Medicaid program does not provide for long-term care services. It was the position of the National Disability Rights Network, that of the ACLU, and that of the American Bar Association. So all of these briefs from the states and from these eminent national organizations contested the arguments of the Justice Department on the basis of Puerto Rico's unique tax status or on the cost of providing qualified Puerto Rico residents with SSI. Now, receiving heightened scrutiny of laws applies to individuals who have historically been relegated to such a position of political powerlessness as to command extraordinary protection from the majoritarian political process. And this is especially so for individuals with group affiliations that have historically subjected them to unintentional or intentional unequal treatment, as many have recognized. So the upshot is that I see valid legal grounds for the court to extend SSI benefits to Puerto Rico and the territories. The court and the political and racial climate of the United States have evolved with respect to Puerto Rico race and ethnicity. And in fact, the government itself is torn. President Biden has said that he supports the equal extension of SSI and other benefits. It's just the Social Security Administration, as part of the executive branch, he has a duty, well, his Justice Department has a duty to defend. So in other words, I see a great deal of fracturing in the US government and in the political climate of the United States. And I don't know how the court will decide. And I am more a student of the territories than of constitutional law in the court as such. But I think the status of the territories is more in play in here than it has been in the preceding cases involving the territories. And there's a great deal of resistance to the treatment of Puerto Ricans. And the court, it seems to me, is on thin ground when it comes to race and the current political climate. And I think there's good reason to think it will find a narrow basis. And we can think of this court's decisions on the Affordable Care Act or even the Obergefell decision to believe that the court may well be ready to turn the corner. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, for this interesting position that you have. Now we encourage the three of you to engage each other. 5 minutes, I think, would be enough. But if you need a little bit more, there's a leeway. Sergio, I thought it was important to mention what are the concrete economic effects of these cases in one way or the other, because it's a huge impact.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
According to our estimates and an analysis we did with a Washington think tank, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, it could be approximately between $2 billion and $2.3 billion a year in benefits to approximately 400,000 individuals in Puerto Rico. who currently do not qualify for this program. And it's important to highlight that this is a very vulnerable population, as Judge Torruella wrote in his opinion. This is a group of individuals that, by the very nature of their conditions, are usually not expected to work and are not active in the labor force due to disability, advanced age, blindness, and other conditions that the federal regulations define. So it would certainly be very helpful to some of the most vulnerable groups in the island. And to give you an idea of the relevance of this case, also, just yesterday, the GAO, the General Accounting Office in Washington, basically issued a legal opinion, which is kind of strange. They're usually not in the business of doing this. It's usually DOJ that issues legal opinions, basically stating that an interpretation by the Health and Human Services Department as to how the Medicaid formula for Puerto Rico would be calculated for the next fiscal year and subsequent years was contrary to the express text of the law it was using as a legal basis for that interpretation. So so it does matter for Puerto Ricans, and especially elder populations and low-income households that benefit from programs like Medicaid and SSI. I am kind of a little bit more pessimistic than Professor Sparrow. I just want to mention that. I think Javier mentioned at the beginning, they're working on 100 years of Balzac. And if you look at the last century of jurisprudence about Puerto Rico at the federal level, we are in a very strange, kind of absurd catch-22 position when we seek recourse against discrimination by the federal government. And it struck me, for example, that in the brief filed by the United States here in Vaello-Madero, the acting Solicitor General for the Biden DOJ argued that, and I quote, that the courts have neither the constitutional authority nor the institutional competence to review Congress's weighting of those of political considerations, which they essentially claim were the basis for denying Puerto Rico SSI treatment. So they're essentially telling Mr. Vaello, go to Congress and get Congress to change the law. So first of all, again, we don't have real representation in Congress, and secondly, who in Congress then would react to Puerto Rico? Congress consists of 535 members, right? 100 senators, 435 members of the House. And I contrast that with a quote that I found from the late Judge Torruella, who wrote in the Harvard Law Review Forum in 2018, and I quote, that it is obvious that Congress will not correct the constitutional and moral injustices created by the democratic deficit that exists in the U.S.-Puerto Rico relationship, just as it failed to do so for African Americans, thus requiring the Supreme Court to redress their festering grievances after almost a century of those grievances being tolerated. Currently, it is up to the courts as guardians of the Constitution and as the originators of this unequal treatment when they validated it in the insular cases to correct these conditions. As the court said in the United States versus Caroline Products case, prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition which tends to seriously curtail the operation of these political processes. So we have a representative, a then representative of the judiciary branch saying, forget about Congress. It's up to us, to the courts, to determine this. We have a representative of the administration, of a Democrat administration, say, no, it's not up to the Congress. It's not up to the courts. It's up to Congress. So again, we're in this weird catch-22 situation that has been enabled by 100 years of federal jurisprudence. Perhaps this is how it always is and has been in the colonies. Heads I win, tails you lose.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would. I might mention that the court has said that, and so did the Solicitor General attorneys. At the same time, in Sanchez Valley, the court explicitly ignored what Congress had passed to Public Law 600, the Federal Relations Act, and then its approval with slight amendment of the Constitution in 1952. So, and we all know the cliche that the court are 9 politicians in black, and as such, they find a way to argue what they want to argue. Yeah, I mean, that's maybe a little bit cruel or cynical, but I'm coming as a political scientist here, not as a jurist, and I just see, at least studying and you're kind of implying this, Sergio, that when it comes to the territories, they'll decide what they want to decide, and if they say, well, sometimes yes, commerce should be uniform, or maybe commerce can't be uniform, or taxation, what have you, they'll do what they want. And I'm just suggesting that I think the climate, and by what's going on in the administration, what happened in the summer of 2020, and all the things that are going on, and I think with Justice Roberts' concern about the legitimacy of the court, it has a real concern. Now, this may not be enough to tip it over, who knows, but I think there's a real concern about the perceptions of the court as being outdated, as being racist, and as not being sort of in touch with the political climate of today. And the signs are better than ever that they might find some way to move on this front.
I just want to mention how ludicrous and sarcastic are the arguments of the US government when you go down to what they are saying. They are saying that Puerto Rico's unique status, tax status, results in fiscal abilities that allow Puerto Rico to give to those in need. But basically what they're saying, because you don't pay federal income tax, personal federal income tax, that leaves more for the government of Puerto Rico to tax their residents and then distribute that money the way they think it will benefit those in need. When really what they are saying is, you will not have access to the cake, and I will leave you some crumbs for you to distribute. And when they say also in a more, I don't know, a good way to say, let's say sarcastic way, that SSI exclusion allows for the advancing of self-government, when we all know that Puerto Rico actually cannot exercise any self-ruling under PROMESA. So this is a DOJ argument brought by the Democrat Party under the administration of Biden, as if they don't know what is happening in the island, and as if they don't know the conditions, and actually who is governing and making determinations about fiscal policies in Puerto Rico, which is not the government in Puerto Rico. So at the end, because of PROMESA and because of the territory clause and because of Aurelius, what we have here is a situation where residents of Puerto Rico do not have anyone to call on. They cannot go to the legislators of Puerto Rico because they don't have any power to legislate for their needs. And they do not have access to the political power in the United States to pursue their own interests and try to advance their needs.
Yeah, there was an interesting exchange between Sotomayor and the US government, where Sotomayor emphasized that the decision to exclude Puerto Rico from the Federal Internal Revenue Service was a decision taken back in the early in the Foro law, and it was a decision by the U.S. government that decided that Puerto Rico could not face federal taxation because the economy was so weak. So to argue now that that is some sort of autonomic decision on the part of the Puerto Rican government, while at the same time you decide things like taking away 936 section of the U.S. Code to have more investment. At the same time you decide all the factors that had to do with the economy at this point. That argument about taking away autonomy from Puerto Rico is weak. It's weak. It's very weak. So we have questions here. Natasha, would you like to read one of them?
There's a question from Misael Ramos and say, what is the likelihood that the decision impact may be minimal in relation to other programs and the general political scenario of the ELA? In other words, the decision may not change anything other than the SSI program. That's the question.
I think that's a good question, and I would like the comment of everyone, but also Sparrow. In terms of I thought that the Supreme Court, or some of them, were sending the message that they don't see exactly where this ends. That if they rule in favor of Vaello, then they will have to rule also in favor of Peña Martinez, which is a class action that argues for the other programs. And they will be also faced with the decision of also having to rule in favor of the other territories. And I thought that at some point they were asking themselves, what is the proper role of the courts in this drama? Which is what Sergio, in a way, is saying the dilemma that we have. We go to the courts, and the courts say no, but go back to Congress, and Congress has not been able to deal with these issues. And as Willmai says, very, very, very efficiently, Puerto Ricans cannot go back to the legislature of Puerto Rico because it is constrained by the Promesa law and the Promesa Junta. So it's a very difficult one. But I just wanted to know your comments, Bat, on whether you really think that the Supreme Court is going to be bold enough to take a decision that may have other repercussions here.
Well, I'm not sure. I think there's, first of all, it was certainly the Solicitor General's position. And as you said, the worry of some justices that where does this stop in terms of which federal benefits and to which territories. One of the things that I think the counsel for the Vaello-Madero pointed out was that this is an exclusively federal program, all federal funds, and has independent of the states. Now, of course, in 1938, it just applied to the states and the district. But of course, then many of the current states weren't even states, like Hawaii, Alaska, Oklahoma. Yeah, no, Oklahoma was just Hawaii and Alaska. But even so, it seems to me that the court could argue and say, look, this is the SSI, this is completely federal, we're ruling this, and leave open for another day what happens. I mean, we see this all the time, that it can find some grounds or another to distinguish ostensibly similar categories. The other thing is, Sergio brought up the amount of money involved, and so have, so did the U.S. government. When you think of the recently passed Infrastructure Act, you look at our defense budget. I mean, this is, maybe it's 3 drops in the bucket. I mean, this is so ludicrous. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous given the stakes and the principles on this issue, given what people have described as a situation of the SSI potential beneficiaries now in Puerto Rico. And in the other territories, the populations are, little over 100,000, 60,000, 40,000. So it's much, much smaller populations. So were this constrained to SSSI, I don't really see this as involving very much cost, despite the renting of clothes and tearing of hair that some would suggest.
What is exactly the consequence of revoking the insular cases? When we let's get in the optimistic mood of my good friend Bat Sparrow here, and some people have suggested that there was some recent case where the Supreme Court revoked the Japanese internment case.
Korematsu.
Korematsu was explicitly revoked. What is exactly when maybe every one of you to say whatever you want. When Justice Gorsuch, I think, said, let's just decide that they were wrongly decided. Let's get rid of them. What is the legal consequence of that the day after?
Well, one thing I just point out that I think, big point initially was not only the culture and ethnicity in Puerto Ricans, it was about the security of the Caribbean basin, given the Panama Canal that was then being constructed, and later on in subsequent cases, concerns about Germany or possibly England or other foreign powers. And to this day, we have Guam. And so I think the United States government, sort of broadly considered, wants to retain that discretion about how it manages. And of course, we have all these old proving grounds and fortifications in Puerto Rico that are now obsolete, but nonetheless, they're there, and remnants of this past where it was very important strategically. And that is still obviously very much the case in Guam. And in fact, one reason why the United States agreed to annex the Northern Marianas Islands, formerly it was just a trust of under the UN, is because of it thought this would have possible military uses and be used as either bases or proving grounds or what have you. So I would suggest that these security imperatives, and then you throw in, of course, the ever issue of race and ethnicity, that these are important factors that I think is going to make it very hard for them out and out dismiss this incorporation doctrine. Yes, they can say maybe things about the language that some of the justices use in their opinions and concurrences, but I think the idea that the United States is, you talked about it and others about the powerlessness of the folks who just have a delegate or a resident commissioner in Congress, and this is something, but it's not really very much. And the body politic within the states can effectively ignore the territories. Once in a while, there'll be something on the news about a hurricane or a presidential visit, but absent that, kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so for all sorts of reasons, I see that as unlikely in the near term.
I completely agree with you, but that many times we don't take into consideration the geopolitical consequences of this. So when the judges are saying so the territorial clause has a specific date by which it should be abolished, I think they are also thinking about the territorial possessions in the Pacific, not only in Puerto Rico. Willmai.
Yeah, and I think that if we divide the insular cases, so one part of the insular cases is about what individual rights are applicable in Puerto Rico, but now almost all rights have been deemed fundamental, ergo they're applicable. So that part of the line of the insular cases may not be troubling for the court to get discarded, but I think that the insular case is still established, and probably the most important tenet of the insular cases is that the United States as a nation has the ability, has the constitutional authority to hold territories that are not destined for statehood. Mm-hmm. And I think that particular issue is not one that Congress will get rid of, that the Supreme Court will say, let's just overrule everything and all the bases for the insular.
That's right. And the other aspect is that Balzac says that to change the status of the territories is a political question that should be left for Congress to do it explicitly, like in the title of the law. And that's also something that I'm not sure that Congress, that the US government wants to get rid of. We have a very interesting question by Francisco Ortiz Santini. Natasha, can you read it?
Sure.
I want to say hello to Francisco. Francisco is an expert on Balzac. He has one of the best books on the Balzac versus Puerto Rico case, because he researched that topic for his thesis, doctoral thesis in Puerto Rico. So thank you for being with us, Francisco.
Okay. His question is, U.S. Supreme Court decisions such as 1918 Puerto Rico versus Murati, 1918 Puerto Rico versus Tapia, and 1980 Harris versus Rosario were basically summary reversals in favor of the insular cases doctrine. Could we expect similar end with Vaello? He also said that he thinks that one of the immediately consequences of revoking the insular cases will be the surrender of the Guantanamo base to the Cuban government since the decision of Boudemine versus Bush in 2008.
I'm not sure about that. I think that Guantanamo is a treaty between Cuba and the United States. It's a really bilateral treaty by which all the two parts have to agree to change the terms of the treaty.
Well, actually, it's a long-term lease, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, we may question the terms under which that
based on a friendship treaty or something like that.
Yeah, we may question the terms.
The doctrinal base, what will be loose for the case. So that's the logical of the.
So the question is whether there would be a summary judgment in this case.
Summary reversal. So hello, Francisco. Nice to see you. We've worked together. One of my first work when I left the Supreme Court. So very happy to see you. I think that I'm not looking at a summary reversal. I think that this will come down as a plurality opinion, but I will not put my money on it. I think that there are enough justices that will go through the territorial clause and says this is the only thing that we have to look at, but that there are other justices that will say let's just not talk about the territorial clause because the result is the same, so we will stay with an equal protection analysis. And if that is the case, then we will have a plurality opinion. And again, I will not put money on it, but that's what I'm thinking is going to.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that analysis too. I think that the fig leaf provided by Califano and Harris versus Torres is basically running a little bit thin. So if the justices could avoid deciding at all the case on that basis, they will try to do so and limit and keep it within the equal protection rational basis analysis and tailor it to that. They probably will try to get away with that, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some, dissents and concurrent opinions, as you mentioned.
Why do you believe that this case has attracted so much attention in the form of amicus briefs of so many organizations? I think that Matt Sparrow was talking about it, and I think it's an interesting development. I don't know, Willmai, if this is exceptional or not, but I was amazed by the number of institutions, and to my knowledge, there was no one feeling an amicus in favor of the U.S. federal government's position. They were completely lonely on this one. Why do you think that? Why do you think this generated so much interest?
I think that
Could
Bart
it be-
could talk
could it
about
be-
it.
But it has to do with Peña Martinez also, the fact that there's another case coming, and that case is also important because it has some other ramifications more than just the SSI.
I don't know. It
Also,
seems. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention that some groups in the Puerto Rican diaspora did organize around this issue and advocated, for organizations to file briefs in this SSI case. So I think that's one issue, and number two, I think since Hurricane Maria, the Puerto Rico has become a lot more visible to the United States, whereas prior to the hurricane, as you mentioned, out of sight, out of mind. After the hurricane and all the coverage we received, with getting electricity back and President Trump coming down here and throwing paper towels and all those things, it has put Puerto Rico somewhat more on the radar than it used to be before.
That's right. Willmai, you didn't finish, please.
No, the only thing that I wanted to add is that Aurelius also brought a lot of amicus. The difference is that in Aurelius, the amicus were not as, it was divided opinion. So they were some with the government and others not. I think that the interesting thing about this amicus briefs is that I think none of them supports the position of the US government. And I think that what Bart was saying about that there is a change and there is a reluctance for the United States or for the United people, particularly those are more progressive, to be attached to such a decision.
But
I was just going to say that I think there's one is, as Willmai suggested, and there is a change in climate and sensitivity and awareness, and especially these really are the most vulnerable of us, right? The elderly and the sick, or no, the blind or disabled or chronically ill. And so this is, I think this sort of gets at, maybe a sort of a philanthropic or sort of a, I'm listening to a book right now that talks about slavery and after slavery. And one of the points it makes is that the churches and charitable organizations in the South were very generous if it was helping poor Blacks, but they would do nothing in the laws or nothing in the structure of government. And this, I think, is maybe a little bit like that, because it doesn't really affect. I mean, the U.S. government argued in its amicus in Sanchez Valley. It talked about the fundamental political and economic and security interests of the United States being implicated in Sanchez Valley, and by implication also Franklin, California. And here it's not that. This does nothing really to change the fundamental premises of territories versus the states. It seems to me what it does is it says, look, insofar as these folks are U.S. citizens, then, and this is a federal policy, will you extend these benefits? And it's saying nothing about them as equal partners in government. It's not saying that these people can vote for a member of Congress, for the president. It's not anything else. It's just a little bit of money spread around because these people are extremely needy, and Puerto Rico especially has been discriminated and has now basically under receivership government. And so that's why I have some reason to believe, and Sergio, I didn't realize about, but that makes sense about all that organization that's going on, that's happening. And this is where actually I think something very important has developed since Boumediene, and that is social media and the internet. And now we have so many more ways of circumventing the blindnesses of the American elite newspapers and the television networks and even the cable channels, is that now there are more and more people who are sensitized to these issues of equality, of race, of discrimination. So I think there are many, many more networks and news of these things happening, as you've suggested. So I think this all has maybe a little bit of grounds for some optimism.
Yeah, you mentioned. I remember at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned a long list of states that
Yeah.
had filed briefs, and in many of those states, I wouldn't say all, but in many of those states, there were advocacy campaigns by Puerto Rican groups to get the state government, the state attorney, to file a brief on behalf of Mr. Vaello. So.
And that's kind of precisely my point, right? People go along, and if there's pushback from the states, they're not going to do that. But this is, it's not costly for the taxpayers of the states.
But aren't you underestimating the other half of the U.S. country, that it is not so favorable of equal treatment to Puerto Ricans? We have just experienced a Trump administration that made an explicit policy of not having funds transferred to Puerto Rico. When you consider U.S. civil society, that's also a part of it, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think the amicus information is telling, though. In Sanchez Valley, there were no amicus briefs for for Puerto Rico. All were in support of I'm sorry, for Sanchez Valley, all were support of the official Puerto Rican position and that of the U.S. government. So I think that's one point. But I think the other point about there's no amicus briefs for different conservative groups or religious groups or all sorts of advocacy groups that we might imagine. You think, well, maybe they could find some grounds. But again, this is, I mean, put it this way, if the conservative justices are in many respects reflecting their people who they associate with, people who supported their rise through the judicial world, through the reflecting their party, this is not something it's going to say, oh, I can't believe that so-and-so is a traitor to our cause. I mean, that's not going to happen if they say, oh, these poor and elderly people need, $58 is unconscionable. And you say, well, okay, $500 for these people. That's still not, you don't get rich on $500 a month. So I think there'll be very little pushback and very little, as the briefs suggest. I just don't think it's something that folks, it's not really the hot button issues in the States as I see it.
Oh, any other question? Any other comment you want to make? Well, then thank you very much for your. Okay, there's one coming here. It's a student asked, he's not so that familiar with the topic, but which this will be treated as a classic case of government discrimination. Willmai, you want to say something about it?
Well, that's the question. Now, whether or not the United States government is discriminating, is not treating equally citizens of the United States in their participation of this program just because of the reason of where they are residing, where they are located. Put it that way, is a very simple question and kind of simple to answer. But of course, when that location is on an unincorporated territory, then everything changes because it's a location that doesn't have the same powers and it doesn't have the same access as other locations such as state. Okay. So we can think about location here as a proxy for of course, a space that reunites people that have been discriminated throughout their history. But I think that is not the question as was presented, or as at least it's litigated by the U.S. government.
Let me ask a question to the panel. How do you evaluate the Biden's argument? I'm not sure it is on Trump's certiorari, but in Biden's position, Biden's Justice Department argues that one of the considerations that has to be taken here is the fact that there is an open-ended question of what is the final political status of Puerto Rico. That Puerto Rico may end up being a free associated state, an independent country, a state, and to the extent that this case has influence on the status debate, it should be decided by Congress. For me, it's interesting in how many occasions the status debate is haunting us and creating forms of. We sometimes believe the status debate has no consequence. It has consequences. It can be used for various purposes. I don't know if you have anything to say about it, but it struck me. It was interesting for me to read a Justice Department memo arguing explicitly that the fundamental relationship between Puerto Rico and states has not been resolved, and that should be taken into consideration by the court.
Yeah, I don't know, conceivably perhaps, but it seems to me that that's, I mean, what is it? The percentage of who support independence is, less than 5%, like 1%, 4% or something. It's a very low percentage. And the statehood, I mean, from what I've seen, there's not even agreement on how you'd word a referendum or what the decision-making process would be. So I think in any kind of realistic or practical world, you say, well, this isn't relevant in this case. What you have are U.S. citizens who are denied equal protection, and since geography is a more or less a proxy for race and ethnicity, except for, yes, some European Americans settle in Puerto Rico, and certainly we know that many hundreds of thousands have come to the states proper from Puerto Rico with what's going on. But
the question is, but how do you explain it as a political scientist to have Biden use that argument?
Well, as I said, I mean, I would be curious what the process was about how they came to their position. I mean, I suspect this is lawyers in the Social Security Administration who passed this along to folks in the Solicitor Generals in the Justice Department, and then they tweak it and put their names on it, and then they go forward with these arguments that they're probably not even familiar with. Or, I mean, you see this with Gannon. He's kind of stumbling around, the Deputy Solicitor General. So I just think this is stuff that they haven't worked through, and the government feels it has to support its own Social Security Administration. So, I don't, again, why would Biden support equal protection and then have his Solicitor General's office argue against it? I mean, this is just, so, I don't think this is really well thought out.
What do you think, Sergio? You've been dealing with these guys for a while now.
I tend to agree with Professor Sparrow's thesis. When the case originally came up, actually the briefs were filed by acting solicitor generals. We didn't even have permanent people appointed to these positions. And when the case originally came up to the Supreme Court, it was in the middle of the transition, right? And if you're a mid-level DOJ lawyer, your instinct is going to be not to rock the boat, right? Look at the precedent, look at what has been decided before, and go with that. So I can understand from a bureaucratic politics perspective why DOJ is doing what it's doing. it's more difficult to understand what Biden is doing, to be honest, from a purely political analysis perspective in the United States. If it is true that the Democrats, or at least a segment of the Democratic Party, is proposing or considering making Puerto Rico a state and DC a state, because that will change the balance of power in the Senate, then what Biden is doing goes against that, right? Doesn't make any sense. And I guess that in the end, they probably haven't thought it through. I hate to put it in those terms. They probably, Professor Sparrow is probably right in that they really haven't thought it through. I just want to point out two technicalities to close before we close. One, even if Mr. Vaello wins in this case, by some 5-4 decision, the way that the case is presented to the Supreme Court, it only applies to Mr. Vaello. This is not a class action lawsuit. Remember, it arose as a claim by the United States to seek reimbursement from Mr. Vaello for $28,000. So it will be limited to Mr. Vaello, even if he wins. Although you're right, there are other cases in the pipeline that would use this as a precedent, not only for SSI, but also for other social welfare programs that apply differently in Puerto Rico, specifically SNAP, which is the successor program to food stamps, and low-income subsidies for Medicare Part D, which is the Medicare Part program that covers prescription drugs. So that's technicality number one. Technicality number two is that the reconciliation bill currently under consideration in the House, the Build Back Better plan, does include Puerto Rico. It changes the definition of the United States to include Puerto Rico in SSI fully. It's a one-sentence amendment, literally, saying the term United States should include Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So that's also included there. It remains to be seen where that bill will get first through the House, given the fight between Democrats, moderates and progressives, and if it ever gets to the Senate, whether or not Senators Manchin and Sinema would actually vote for it. So it still has a ways to go, but SSI is included as part of that bill as we speak today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Natasha, there are some new questions. Can you help us out?
Sure. We have one from Marta Ramos that is asking if this case will be converted in a class action lawsuit. I would think that it's too late for that.
Yes.
Because
it will have some kind of impact in the Peña Martinez case.
Yes.
It will have an impact on that class case. Yeah.
And there are other cases besides Peña Martinez that are already starting to come up through the district court here in Puerto Rico. So and those are true class action suits. So I agree. If Mr. Vaello prevails, the opinion, the decision will be limited. The remedies will be limited to Mr. Vaello. But there are other cases in the pipeline that affect not only SSI but other programs that would use this as a precedent.
Okay, there's one for another question from Jose is, if Vaello is revoked, as many think, will the First Circuit without Torreya try again to challenge the Supreme Court with this type of cases? There's another Puerto Rican judge coming to the First Circuit.
Yeah, it's actually Judge Helpi who decided this case. Who decided this case in the first instance? And by the way, look at the procedural posture. I mean, he actually got Mr. Vaello at counsel. He threw out the stipulation that he had signed with the SSA, basically agreeing to pay back. And he did not allow the U.S. government to dismiss its own lawsuit. So he actually was very involved, hands-on, in how this actually got to the Supreme Court. It was not a coincidence. And now he's at the First Circuit. So we don't know. I assume he will keep pushing his judicial philosophy as he has done his entire life. I don't see any reason why he would change.
That's right.
And we have another question, and it's from Luis Sanchez. And he's asking, it is possible that this case may impact labor laws in the midst of the pandemic. For example, can a person who has been paid a certain rate while working remotely be asked to move back to the States so his or her salary can be honored?
Well, I think that's probably a whole different issue, but it's interesting that there are some Americans that are working remotely in Puerto Rico. To what extent that affect any kind of access to federal programs? But generally, those who come to do that are not welfare recipients.
Yes, that what I would say is that the SSA program in their requirements are very, very strict and limited for persons that are actually in need. And basically we're talking about persons that cannot work. So I don't think that a person that is working right now could be even be part of the program.
And
but I will add, because he talks about migration. So maybe because of Vaello, a lot of people now know, people in need in Puerto Rico that only receive $48 through the other program said, well, if I move to, then I will receive something more and can have a better standard of living. So we can see a reverse position. And so instead of allowing those $2 billion to be distributed among the needy, then you have a migration of elderly who are in need or disabled who are in need.
And if you add to that the implementation of the austerity measures that come with the signing of the agreement with the board, then you have a perfect storm for that.
okay, we have Professor Alex Betancourt question. It is not Biden position seems to be extended SSI through Congress while avoiding a fundamental change by the court. The move from Biden's administration to try to pass the legislation through Congress as a way to avoid changing by the court.
Well, but
the question, I think the question is whether Biden is using the congressional route to keep out the judicial branch from this controversy and maintain jurisprudence as it is.
Well, if that is true, his lawyer doesn't think so, because he was asked specifically if there is a law passed by Congress that allows for residents of Puerto Rico to receive SSI, that it will the case will become moot. And the lawyer for the administration said no, that the case will still be good and it will not be mooted for that. So I don't think so.
Sergio, what do you think?
No, I agree with Professor Rivera. I remember vividly when one of the justices asked that question, and basically the Solicitor General said that the core issue would survive, which is the applicability, Congress's power to treat territories differently under the territorial clause, so that issue in his mind would survive. So and he was very explicit about it. So.
And finally, we have a question by Selena Romani, and it's at this 2021 historical juncture, should we still be discussing whether the Supreme Court should on a piecemeal basis continue to rewrite our colonial situation?
Who wants to take that one?
I'm just going to say that I agree.
And No, it's a great question, and it's very valid. And as I mentioned earlier, after 100 years of jurisprudence, we are in a absurd position right now, where we're being tossed back and forth to different branches of the United States government without coming to a resolution of this limbo we have been in a way since the Insular cases were decided. If you think about it, as Professor Rivera mentioned, basically all the fundamental parts of the Constitution apply to Puerto Rico already. I mean, all the fundamental rights are protected. Social welfare programs, that's the question. Can Congress treat us differently? In some cases they do, in others they don't. It appears to be completely random. And then in terms of political rights, we don't have any, except electing a non-voting representative to Congress, right? So we have a strange kind of truncated citizenship, if you will, that provides for the protection of civil rights, freedom of association, freedom of speech, but when it comes to things like SSI, Medicaid, Medicare, Congress essentially has broad leeway to do essentially whatever it wants. And then in terms of political rights, if you live in Puerto Rico, you basically have no political rights. It really doesn't make any sense to have that as your citizenship in 2021, in the 21st century. Yeah. So I don't know, that's the way I see it.
Yeah, and to add complexity to that, Sergio, the Supreme Court is discussing whether to revoke or not Roe v. Wade, and then in Puerto Rico, the legislature already doesn't have a right, a woman, to terminate the abortion, so would immediately eliminate that right in Puerto Rico. Without any kind of meaningful political participation in the process. So it again, we tend to see the things theoretically, but they have very, very clear impacts. But do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, no.
Or you want to leave Puerto Ricans to talk it out?
No, I think this is what interested me in studying the insular cases in Puerto Rico, is that most Americans, as you know, in that forum in PS about why teach the territories, or teaching the territories, is that we think of the United States as a federal republic with this enclave, the District of Columbia, but we've always had territories ever since, even before the Constitution. We had the Northwest territories. And so anyway, so the question is, well, why this odd, liminal, ever-changing situation in Puerto Rico and the other territories? And it's, it doesn't fit into Republican government. It doesn't fit into, obviously, all of the protections of our Constitution and its amendments. And it's, it really makes no sense, it seems to me. And this is what has been very clear with Promesa and the certainly Sanchez case and Franklin, California, and others. This is just an exercise of power by the federal government and Congress, because they can, and if they need to change, or there's some reason to grant or do something, then they will. I mean, this is what seems to me that happened with citizenship in 1917. It was, well, okay, we'll grant citizenship, but Puerto Ricans themselves, as you know, were equivocal on it. And they knew that it didn't do very much. It didn't change really the situation from Gonzalez much at all. But nonetheless, they did this. And so now I sort of see this as just unaccountable abuse of power, and really a very sad commentary on our founders and the ostensible principles on which the United States was founded.
Well, on that note, I think we have covered a lot of terrain here. I am very, very grateful, Sergio, Willmai, Pat, for your participation. Thank you very much. It has been an excellent panel. And I hope that those who have been with us have the same conclusion. So thank you very much, and we will keep in touch.